Before we can actually test our two routes, the sign up route and the get users me route, we're going to need to add some seed data to the database for the users collection. We're going to need to use that data in order to test things like Authenticate. If we want to make sure this route works, we're going to need to pass along an XAuth token inside a supertest, which means we're going to need an XAuth token in the database in order for this call to work. To set up our seed data, we are going to kick things off by opening up server test.js, but instead of adding more code on here, making this file more bloated than it already is, we're going to create a separate file that's responsible for creating the seed data and defining the function that gets passed to before each. Before we add anything new, we're simply going to migrate this functionality over to the new file. Then we can verify it still works. Then we'll move on adding user seed data. First up, I am going to run the test suite using npm test to prove that all my test cases are still working. Then we're going to make the change, moving this to a new file, and we'll run npm test again to make sure we haven't broken anything. Now this new file is going to live in the tests folder. We're going to make a new folder called seed, and inside of the seed folder, we'll make a file called seed.js. Inside of here, we're going to add the code we have over in server test.js. At the very top of the file, the first thing we want to grab is that to-dos array. This array is going to be added to the database. I'm going to cut it out of the server file and paste it in here. Next up, we are going to be grabbing the function that gets passed to before each. We're not going to grab the actual before each call, just the function. Now over in server.js, we can define a new function. Let's make a const called populate to-dos, and we'll set that equal to the function we just copied. Now we have everything defined over in the seed file as opposed to the server file. We're not quite done yet. We do need to load in some imports. We use the object ID constructor, and we also access the to-do model. That means up at the top of the file, we're going to have to add 2 lines. First up, let's go ahead and load in the object ID constructor function. We'll make a const object ID using ES6 destructuring, just like we've done before. Make sure to spell it right though. And then we'll go ahead and require it off of MongoDB. Next up, we're going to go ahead and load in that to-do model because we do call to-do.remove and to-do.insert many to modify the collection. We'll make a const. We'll call that const to-do using ES6 destructuring, and we will go ahead and require it using a relative path. Now we are in the tests seed directory, which means we're going to need to go up 2 directories, out of seed and out of tests. Then we'll go into models. That means we'll use ... to go up 1 directory and ... again to go up a second directory. And now we can go ahead and reference the models directory and finally the file to do. Now that we have both of our imports in place, the last thing to do is export the to-dos array, since we do use that in the server test file. Down below, we access it inside of our tests cases, and we're also going to export the function we just defined, populate to-dos. Module.exports is going to equal an object, and on there we'll add those 2 things, to-dos and populate to-dos. Excellent. With our exports in place, the seed file is done, and we can move into the server test file to load in the seed data. Right here, just below where I require the to-do model, I am going to go ahead and use a constant, and we're going to pull off a few of those properties. We're going to pull off the to-dos array, and we're going to pull off populate to-dos. We're going to grab all of that from the file we just created using require. We'll use a relative path since it is a local file. It's in the seed directory, and the file name itself is called seed. Now, we don't need to do anything with the to-dos array. We simply reference it down below like we did before, and everything works as expected. But we are going to need to pass in populate to-dos right here. With this in place, we have not changed a single piece of functionality. We've just refactored our program to move some code out of server test and into the seed file. Now that we've made this change, I am going to rerun the test suite to verify that everything is still working as expected. Here, all 11 tests are passing, which means we're ready to move on, adding some seed data for that users collection. In order to seed the users, we are going to create a users array, much like we did for to-dos, and we'll also make a populate users function, much like we did for to-dos down below. First up, let's go ahead and load in the user model. We'll make a const called user, and we're going to require it using a very similar path. It's a relative path. We're going to go back those two directories, then into models, and finally the user file is what we want to grab. Now that we have this in place, we can define a constant called users, and this is going to be the array of users we add as our seed data. We're going to add 2 users, so I'm going to add 2 objects to the array. The first user, this is going to be a user with a valid authentication token, and the second user is going to be a user that does not have any authentication tokens. And we'll use the second user for things like testing what happens when we don't pass an XAuth token. For now, though, we can start filling out these users. The first one is going to have an underscore ID property. We're going to set that equal to a new object ID. Then we can set up an email and a password. A good email for this one would be andrew@example.com. And finally, that password field, I'm going to set password equal to user1pass. Next up, we are going to need to provide the tokens array. Remember, the tokens array is an array of objects, and every object has 2 properties, access and token. The access property is easy enough. We simply set access equal to the string auth, but the token property is going to be a little more difficult. The token property is going to require us to call jwt.sign, just like we do over inside of user.js down below. Right here, we sign our data, creating the token. We're going to need to do the exact same thing using the exact same secret, ABC123, in order to create the seed data. Now, we are going to need to reference the user ID inside of that call. And since we've provided it right here, there's no way to reference it. So instead, what I'm going to do is make a variable, a constant called user1ID, and I'm going to set that equal to the object ID. Then I can reference this wherever I want down below. I'm going to pass it in right here, user1ID, and I'm going to pass it into our call to jwt.sign. Now, before I can call that function, I am going to load it in, const jwt, and we're going to require the JSON Web Token library. Now we can call jwt.sign, passing in the necessary arguments. For the data that we want to sign, we're going to have our 2 values, the ID, which we have access to via the user1 ID variable, and access, which, as we know, we're just going to set equal to the string auth. Next up, we are going to need to go ahead and provide the exact same secret we used earlier. The secret we used was ABC123, so I'm going to provide that as the second argument. I'm also going to wrap up this call by calling toString, converting this into the string token. Now that we have the first user in place, we can go ahead and add our second user, and the second user is going to be a lot more simple. We're not going to have to add the tokens array. I am going to make a variable to store its ID though, a const user2ID variable, and we'll set that equal to a new object ID. Now down below, we can add the 3 attributes necessary, ID, email, and password. ID obviously will equal the variable we just created. The email can equal any email that we haven't used. We only used one. So I'm going to go ahead and use jen@example.com. And finally, we can provide a password. And I'm going to stick with that same scheme for the password property. I used user1pass for this one. I will use user2pass down below. Now we have our users created, and it's time to start actually populating the database. We're going to do that via a function really similar to populate to-dos. There's one important caveat though. Insert many is what we currently use to insert our records into the database, but this is not going to run our middleware, which means when we insert these records, the plain text password is going to get stored in the database. Obviously, that's going to cause some problems later when we try to test things because our tests are going to assume the password was properly hashed. In order to save these users and have the password hashed, we're going to tweak how we create our populate users function. Const populate users is going to be the name of the function. And we are going to set it equal to an arrow function that gets the done argument, just like we do for populate to-dos up above. Now inside of populate users, things are going to start much the same. We're going to wipe all of the users in the database by calling user.remove, and we're going to pass in that empty object to remove every single record. Then we'll tack on a then callback. And inside of here is where we're going to actually add the records. I'm going to add this missing semicolon, and now we can go ahead and start by creating those users. The first thing I'm going to do is make a variable called user1, and we're going to set this equal to a new user, and we're going to pass in the object that is the first item in the user's array. We can get that by accessing the first item using the 0 index. Then we can go ahead and call save on this, and the value that gets returned from save, that is what's going to be in user 1. Now, as we know, that is a promise, which means we can tack on then, and we'll be using that in just a moment to sync things up. We're going to do the exact same thing for user 2. Var user2 equals a new user. We're going to grab the second item from the array with the index of 1, and we'll be calling save, getting the promise back. Now we have two promises, user 1 and user 2. We want to wait for both of them to succeed. And there's actually a promise utility method that lets you do just that. It's called promise.all. Promise.all takes an array of promises. We can pass in our array, user 1 and user 2. Then we can call then. And this callback, it's not going to get fired until all of those promises resolve, meaning that user 1 and user 2 were successfully saved to the database. By calling save, we are going to be running the middleware, and by using promise.all, we'll be able to wait for all of those save actions to complete. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove the then callback here, and instead, I'll return the promise all result, so I can tack on then right here. Right here, all I'm going to do is do what we did above. I'm going to call done, wrapping up the populate to-dos middleware function. Now with this in place, we are done. We can go ahead and run our test suite and see exactly what kind of data we get over in RoboMongo. Now over inside of RoboMongo, we have some weird data inside of the test file. Inside of collections, I have leftover user data. I'm going to go ahead and drop this to-do app test database. This will get recreated when we run the test suite. Over inside of Atom, I'm going to save the seed file, and I am going to be adding a second before each call over inside of server test. First up though, I do need to export populate users, and I need to export the users array up above. Right here, we're going to export users, and we'll export populate users. And over inside of our server test file, we can add both of those as constants, users, populate users. And we'll pass populate users in to a second call to before each. I'm going to add the second call before populate to-dos, populate users. Excellent. Now that we have this in place, we can rerun the test suite. All of the tests should pass. We haven't actually changed any of the test cases. The real goal for rerunning the test suite is to see what kind of data we have in the test database once the test cases are complete. Over in RoboMongo, I'm going to refresh my connection, go into the to-do app test database, and see what I have inside of the users collection. Inside of here, I have two records. The first one looks exactly like our second record. We have gen@example.com, we have our ID, and we have our hashed password. Notice there's nothing in the tokens array. The second record is the first item we have in the users array. Right here, we have our ID, our email, the hashed password, and we also have our token. This token is going to be used inside of our test case to run those tests that require authentication. With this in place, we are now done. We have a really great seed file. This seed file abstracts all of that seed-related functionality and doesn't need to live in server test where it was just taking up space. Now that we have this in place, it's time to move on and actually write test cases that use this seed data. That's coming up next, so stay tuned. I will see you then.